Good morning. Good morning. Okay, we continue our journey in reviewing the conclusion of Ayin Beis, Hamshech Ayin Beis. And also, as we are entering, when is Rosh Chodesh today? Tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh. Should also be a good month of Geula. This is the month called Chodesh HaGeula, Kislev, Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. So it all fits into what we're doing, learning here. So we're on page in Ayin Beis in volume 3. We are on page, let's see here, 1417. So the last class on Friday, I gave an overview of essentially the early, if you wish, I don't want to call it the Big Bang, because the Big Bang would be more associated with the Tzimtzum HaRishon, but the early genesis of, in the highest levels, from Atzmus, wishing to have a dir b'tachtenim, so the dynamics that God put into place to allow us to have some inkling or some understanding, some sense of what takes place on those levels. So we talked about Atzmus, built in Mitzias Nimtza. We talked about the Yechelus Atzmus, the term the Alter Rebbe uses to try to describe God's capacity, which is already, I don't like the word step down, but it's definitely a step forward from Atzmus. And then, of course, what we spoke about, shame and oir as its kol b'atzmusei kadmin kekadmusei, which is the level of Yechelus, as he explained here. And then as the levels begin to emerge and ultimately develop into some form of structure to create the structure of our existence. So you have its earliest roots in those highest levels. And that is definitely parts of what the Rebbe Rashab is touching upon right here, what we're learning now, and what we've been learning the previous pages and will be learning. And this, of course, connects to the neshamas and Torah, which is the real, the two forces that actually transform this world into dir b'tachtenim, being that neshamas are rooted all the way in those highest levels. So neshamas have the power to actually transform this world, because they come with the DNA from the deepest levels of Yechelus, or what he called before Helama Atzmi Shmei Hakol Batzmusei, and Torah, which is very close to the neshamas, even though they generally speaking, even though the neshamas are higher than Torah, but generally speaking, as the Medrash said, Shnei Dvarim Kadmu Le'elam. And Ein Yedeya, we learned that we don't even know which precedes which. And then he finally says, neshamas are higher. Now, we don't know because there are aspects with Torah is higher than neshamas, and there are times when neshamas are higher than Torah, as we learned at length, their relationship. Because neshamas need Torah to illuminate, Torah oir, just like the eye needs an outside siyua, light, in order to illuminate, for it to be able to see in darkness. So the neshamas in this dark world cannot see on their own, even though they can see with their eyes, but they need an outside light. And the Einei Ha'eda that illuminate the guiding light of our leaders, and the Malachim and the Siyua of the Malachim. On the other hand, when the Neshamas begin to be illuminated and can illuminate the world, the Neshamas then activate their deeper powers to actually transform the world, because the Torah alone does not transform the world. The Torah is essentially not a transformer. The Torah is HaChachmasev R'Sheina Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu. But it's the neshamas that are active in manifesting within a body and walking on this earth and breathing, and the ones that implement and learn and implement Torah and mitzvahs. So it's the neshamas that ultimately are the ones that have to deal with the battle with the animal soul, to deal with the battle of this material world, and turn it into a dir b'tachtenim. But when we know the dynamics of where neshamas are rooted and where Torah is rooted and how they interact with each other, obviously the picture begins to unfold in the way that we're discussing here. So we're in the middle of all this, all part of the bigger picture. To get it back to where we are specifically here, so he's been talking about what does a neshama do when it comes down below. So in order to be able to transform the world, it needs avodas Hashem. And a big part of that avodah is davening. Another part of that avodah is learning Torah. And more specifically, what we've been learning here is, in addition to transforming the world, we're also talking about transforming midas hadin, the negative forces in life, especially the way they devolve on a negative form, to turn them also into chesed, into kindness, and to love, which in other words is v'haftas Hashem Elokecha b'chol avavcha b'shnei yetzerecha, transforming the animal soul into loving God, even though he doesn't use that particular expression here, but it's the context, because he's been speaking about b'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol ma'idecha, and will continue to speak. The Maimer HaMagbi L'Sheves emphasizes that. So how does the neshama do it? So he's speaking about, firstly, the Maimer Chazal we've been learning, Kol ha'oina omen yeshmei rabba b'chol koichei. Every person who responds with Amin Yeshmei Rabba, with all his koyach, and he interprets koyach kavana, kol kavanose, kedon le'gzar din. So you see the power that our Aveda has in this world, gzar din. If you think about it, gzar din includes every element of gvura, all the way to the lowest levels, which is of course the negative, like nimrod, the divisiveness, the klippas, and even the worst possible energy, the negative energy, ra, down on earth. But it also includes gzar din. Din is also the tzimtzum. So in a way you could say, Hamin Yesh Meirabah counters the effects of the tzimtzum and of gvuras. Again, he doesn't use these words, but if you think of the broader context of Ayin Beis, it makes total sense, because that's what we've been talking about. How do we transform the tzimtzum? And we can't bypass, we don't want to bypass the tzimtzum, we don't want to override it, we want to transform it. That was a big part of the theme that began in the middle of volume 2, which continues in this volume as well, the transformation of the tzimtzum and the different v'yadaita hayom ke'avayu alikim b'shamayim emal va'oretz metochas ein eid. So part of that was the discussion of transforming alikim, which is the tzimtzum havayu hu alikim, and even further that we learned earlier in the process of the interface from the bottom up, ein eid, that the tzimtzum itself reveals the helam ha'atzmi. But that's not the focus here. I just stated it for the record. Here, the focus is more transforming that tzimtzum to light, midas hadin to midas haches and midas harachamim. So you see, our avodah, Amin Yesh Meirabah, does that. So though he's specifically speaking more here about midas hadin, the negative, because he says clearly the gvuras, what he's talked about, the gvuras that devolve into, well, he doesn't say it explicitly, but earlier we talked about chamisha l'ra, like Nimrod, which of course was really the negative force, but it also includes in general that transformation. And how does the neshama do that? Through its avodah of Amin Yesh Meirabah. So it's invoking higher levels than ishtalshlus, because since the neshama is rooted where? In Atik, or in the roots before the tzimtzum in Shmei HaKol Batzmusa and Helam Ha'atzmi, so therefore the neshama has the power through its avodah of Amin Yesh Meirabah Chol Koichei to actually transform the tzimtzum, turning midas hadin and midas hagvura. From a point of view of ishtalshlus, it's two tracks, chesed and gvura, like we said, two arms, two hands. The right hand, the left hand, the 5 fingers of the right, 5 fingers of the left, the 10 spheres. The 14 joints of the right hand, the 14 joints which add up to koyach maisov, higid la'ame, creation. But then yigdal na koyach adnai, the 28 letters of Shema, that allows the neshama to be able to access higher levels and transform. The next part, which we're learning now, to bring it up to where we are presently, is so in order to have that overpowering force from Atik, from the higher levels, that should give the power to transform, that comes from the Amin Yisrael, b'chol keiche, b'chol kavanase. So now the next section is dedicated to understanding what means kavana. And not just kavana, kol kavanase. It means all your intention. So clearly referring to a particular avodah. And essentially what he's going to explain is the avodah of our contemplation of connect and understanding and perceiving and experiencing divine unity. And kol kavanase is going to refer to the whole process of that contemplation, the unity from the lowest levels to the highest levels. So to begin to discuss that, he starts from the top. He says, to understand kol kavanase, let's begin with kol hamayrich be'echad, which means anyone who extends echad, and extends, as we're going to learn, means in this case not just in its pronunciation, in its expression, but also extends in its contemplation, echad. His days and years will be extended. So he says, what do we have to understand? What is this arichus of echad? And to explain that, he began with the pasuk, Vayemahu yiyeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad. And he explained the Maimar Chazal that explains that means that la'asulavi in the future there'll be total seamless unity, both in the name of Hashem and His name, that the name will be pronounced exactly the way it is read. So what is tzarich lahaven inyan v'shmo echad? What is shame? So he started explaining shame, and that's what we discussed in the last few classes, that shame is an entity that God chose to manifest something that will be some form of expression. And how he defines expression, he says, a shame, p'chinas eisius. As soon as you say a name, means you're some way you have some form of definition, letters. That's what a name is. In other Maimarim, it speaks about shame in different ways, but it's all connected to that. And we're going to see here, he's going to use eisius as an operative example, next few pages, of how we're ma'arich be'echad by understanding the divine unity. So let me just say a few words about that before I continue summing this up. So it works like this. If you learn in Tanya, chapter 20, 21, 22, 23, I'm right now teaching that actually. I'm up to chapter 23. In Tanya, you see the Alter Rebbe uses eisius as operative example to understand Achdus Hashem. And he does so again in Shai Yechid V'Amunah. And let's spell out what that means. When God created existence, He could have created it any way He liked. Could have just said, poof, yesh ma'ayin, Bereshis bara Elokim Shemayim V'Haaretz, and you have a heaven and earth, and all the multitude of details, all the trillions and trillions and the almost infinite amount of details of existence. But He didn't do it that way. He did it through speaking. Like it says, Vayemer Elokim, Yehi Oyer, Vayehi Oyer, Vayemer. So that tells us, right in the beginning of Chumash, that God chose to do it through speaking. Now, did He have to speak? Of course not. Even thought God doesn't need. He wants something, it exists, and that's it. But as I've said many times, God wanted us to have some understanding of how He did it, so we can relate to Him, and also gives us the ability to retrace the steps, because now we have these so-called stepping stones of understanding it. So when we say God spoke, we say, oh, so now we can understand His way of speaking by looking at our way of speaking. When I'm speaking to you right now, when we communicate with each other, what are we essentially doing? We're essentially connecting. If I didn't speak, or you didn't speak, or we didn't speak to each other, we would have no relationship. So speech is one of the key things in a relationship between one and another. And speech carries, it's a carrier. It's a carrier of what I want to say to you. My feelings, my thoughts, my ideas. I'm not getting into what you speak about. Obviously, Torah regulates and tells us, speak good things, don't speak lashon hara. But bottom line is, speech is an expression. So even though someone will say to you, is your speech your essence? You'll say, no, my speech is not my essence, but I try to express as much as I can from within me to another. Now, obviously, there's some casual conversations we have, superficial ones, surface level conversations, but then we also have deep conversations. Two people can speak about the things that are most intimate and closest to their heart and soul. So bottom line is, speech is a channel of communication. So when we say God spoke, obviously, as he explains in Tanya, God speaking is very different than our speech. But there are similarities. Like he says in Tanya, Dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in the language of man, also Dibra Torah. And why? Because it's giving us something to hold on to. We could say, okay, from our speech, we can come to understand God's speech. Even though, like he says in Tanya, God's speech is not like. So we always have to qualify it. But there are commonalities. And the first commonality is that it's an expression to another. So in a sense, as soon as you say there's the eisius, in this case, eisius Hashem, he's not talking about eisius hadibur yet. Eisius Hashem, you're saying God has created, and again, I'm careful, I don't want to use the word created, but God has chosen to manifest in some form of expression. And that's what a shame is. Esis. We'll soon learn that there's esis hamachshava, letters of thought and letters of speech, and of course letters in writing. But that's already as it turns into real detailed letters. The concept, the very concept of expression can be called shame because shame is esis. Like he says, esis from the word asa, it carries. Asa means it brings, it channels, it delivers. Shu'in hagilui. So what is this gilui? So we have now the concept of gilui, which is essentially revelation, expression. This does not necessarily mean gilui to somebody because there's no one to be megala, but the concept, the very concept that God is going to allow himself to be nizgala, express himself in some way, is what a shame is. So on one hand, it's already, yes, some form of expression. On the other hand, it has no real substance of its own. All it is a reflection from whatever it is, from the source where it's expressing. As we can know, the words, let's say, even of speech, are not are without the content. They're just letters. That's all they are. So how about like letters of speech? So we're soon going to learn that by understanding these letters on all the levels, from the shame Shmei Bilvad, like he said, Hayhu Shmei Bilvad, as we'll soon learn, all the way down to the Shema says they become actual manifest names and letters of thought, speech, and action. The contemplation of that will allow us to understand Hamayrik Be'echad Achdus, because it's these letters that carry godly energy, and these are the letters that give power and create existence. Dvar Hashem, Shemayim Nasu, and that's the central theme there in those chapters in Tanya that I referred to, 20 through 22, basically, 23 2, actually 20 through 25, to be really exact, but mostly 20 through 23. And these letters, what do? They carry the energy that creates existence. 10 statements, Maimores, with what God created the world. And it's these letters, like he explains later in Shar Yechid V'Amuna, is these letters that are the ones that constantly, perpetually create. And if for 1 second, these letters would be nostalgic, would be removed. If God stopped speaking, all of existence would disappear. Because existence has no substance of its own. All it is God's speaking. It's the words of God. But that allows us to understand Achdus because we understand now how God relates to us. Because it's not just God created and it's a mystery. It's not a mystery. Everything in existence has letters that are vivifying that thing. Now, we don't have that power. When we say something, it doesn't create and it doesn't give, it just communicates. It conveys an idea, a feeling. With God's letters, they actually create. They actually create. So essentially, if you were talking the language of science, we say every object in existence is made up of elements, which is in turn comprised of molecules, which in turn is made up of atoms and subatomic particles. If you keep going down the rabbit hole, you'll ultimately get to the letters of God that give the energy to the subatomic particles, which in turn continue to evolve until you have a physical body of water or fire or any other object in existence. So behind it all lies divine letters. I mean, today a good example for this is computer program. You know, when you use your phone or you use your computer, we all know there's a programming where you're using the outer interface. Behind that is a program that was written. Behind that is a machine language, which comes down to a bunch of zeros and ones that are just situated and combined in different combinations. Zeros and ones, that's all it is. Zeros and ones. So it says there it's numbers, zeros and ones. I pointed out that zero is like an eagle and one is like a kav, makif and pnimi. But regardless, the bottom line is that it all comes down to, so anyone can understand that today. And yet it combines in literally infinite amount of applications.
It's around
every application we do.
47, I don't know.
Whether you're typing, whatever it is that you're doing, is all really just essentially taking that language the machine language and turning it into something that you can use. So it's an excellent example for how God does it. Obviously, far more beyond that and far more complex and so on. But that's essentially the concept of letters. So he begins by saying shame. When you say name, it's not that God has a name and he needs a name. Like he said, the name is not negated to him. Just like Esi Sadibur, coming from the Etzem HaNefesh, he says like this. I'm just reading what we learned. It's not negated to him at all. This doesn't, like he says, Shagam im yedaber, kama diburim, harba. If a person will speak many words, or he won't speak at all. That does not diminish and does not increase or add to the nefesh. Now, this doesn't mean it doesn't add understanding. Obviously, you speak something, you can explain it. But the very nefesh is not, if no one was on earth and you had no one to speak to, your nefesh would not become diminished. You may be lonely, and you may not be able to fulfill everything you want to fulfill, but the nefesh remains intact. And he gives the example like the light of and reflection of the sun. Why? Because it's only ha'ara. If it was something that was coming from the etzem of the shemesh, so then it is negeya. It's negeya because it's a part of the shemesh. But all this is a reflection of the sun. It's like your reflection in a mirror. Does that change who you are in any way? No, it's just a reflection. It's not a piece of you. So in that sense, it's only Ara Levad. I'm just reading again for what we've learned, just to be able to have the flow. But now we can understand its deeper meaning. And same thing with the letters of speech. That's not negated to the etzem. And now he goes back to shame. Now let's go back to the name. A name is not negated to the etzem. It doesn't mean it doesn't touch the etzem. It doesn't mean it's not coming from the etzem. But it's not negated in any direct way. So you have here now the etzem has manifested in the name. So on one hand, the name is already some form of gilui. Like he said, Oisi is gilui, Osa. It's delivering something, it's expressing something. On the other hand, it's not negated to the etzem. Which explains also why Chassidus explains why is used, because Ani Hashem Leishanisi, it doesn't change the etzem. And yet, it changes everything, because without that, you won't have existence, at least in the way that we could understand it. So in that sense, it changes the way God creates. That's what it changes, but not the etzem. Okay, the next thing we learned was that's why one nefesh can have a number of names, because if the shame was negated to the etzem, so if a person, let's say, was called Avram, so even if he returns later in a Gilgal in another reincarnation, he should also be called Avram. He says, no. And one person, this nefesh, could have one name, and when that soul enters into another person, and he can be called another name. That's my nefesh. That's the parentheses. Now, two more lines to where we're up to, and that's what Pirkei D'Rabbanan, and that's what means, and that's why the Zohar calls Gili Ein Sof b'Shem Eir, and B'Loshna Gemara b'Medrash V'Medrash or Medrash Rabbah Nikra Shem. So now we'll understand why the Zohar uses Eir, which we know Eir, light, like sunlight. God doesn't give off sunlight, but still that's the word that's used. And in the language of Gemara and Medrash, it's called Shem. So here you see clearly that Shem and Eir are interchangeable. You're saying it's exactly the same level. Just the question is where you're reading it, whether it's in Zohar or it's in Gemara and Medrash. And he brings the Pirkei D'Rabbanan, the famous Pirkei D'Rabbanan, which is Medrash. There the word is Shem. Actualize nivra elam hayehu v'shmei bolvad. That before creation, until the actualize nivra, pre-creation, just him and his name. Shezeu b'chinas Ein Sof shebezayar. Now he adds Kisra Arizal too. So when it says he says that is the level of Ein Sof. So it's referring to the Ein Sof that precedes the Tzimtzum and precedes existence. The Eir v'Shem u'davar echad. Eir and Shem are one thing. What is that thing? That it's only a reflection from Atzmus, but it has added now the element of Gili and expression. But the point is that the Gili and expression is not through an outside thing that adds or subtracts anything. It itself is only a reflection. Why is this so important? Because in the interface, if the Oid or Shem would have been something of substance and it would add something, then in a way you don't have a pure interface. Because then Atzmus is compromised, Kavyachol, so to speak. Because he's now moved to, it's like a translator. A translator is another entity. A translator takes the language and translates it. Oid and Shem don't have any, all they are is a reflection. So in that sense, they reflect only what Atzmus is. There's no addition. They don't have the capacity to add anything. It's like saying sunlight is going to add something to the sun. It doesn't add anything. All it does is it channels and transmits sunlight to Earth or to wherever it's transmitting sunlight. And actually, it transmits it in a way that gets more diminished. But bottom line is it's not transmitting something else because it has nothing else. All it has is what the source gives it, like a reflection, exactly what a reflection is. When you look in a mirror, the mirror is not going to add anything. I'm not talking about if there's any additives or any other distortions in the mirror. A pure reflection is a pure reflection. So on that end, it's expressing Atzmus. On the other end, it's not pure Atzmus because it's a reflection, not Atzmus. It's already an expression. So you have here something that we can hold on to. The Oisius Hashem, or what he calls Oisius, he means here, just for the record, he doesn't mean any particular letters. If you say, what Oisius, there's no Yud, K, Vav, K, or anything yet. It's just the concept of expression, like I've been explaining. The idea that there is something that Atzmus now wants to express into what I call from Bil to Mitzias Nimtza into Mitzias Nimtza. And there, obviously, the next stages and the next steps, things will begin to evolve into more manifestation that will actually become actual letters. So when we say Yehi Oyer, that's already a specific expression. We're not even there yet. We're now right just the fact that there's a shame, which means that it's made that the concept of Oisius. And that's where we stopped in the last class when we were learning inside, 2 classes back. Okay, so that was some context, a little more to understand the whole process here. So we're going to see here now, as I said, this is going to lead us into seeing that when you start thinking about these, the shame, and then from shame to Oisius and so on, and he's going to speak now about the different levels of Oisius, that'll give us the ability to contemplate Ma'arich be'echad, and understand the divine unity that this shame and the Oisius allow us to appreciate the interface between the existence of many different things and then trace them all back, meaning the creation itself, and trace it back to the letters. They all go back to the zeros and ones, or in this case, to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which are the letters that God used to manifest through shame into creating existence. So the Oisius are now going to be the way we can contemplate on this. And as I said, though he doesn't say it later, he does refer to Tanya. I think in a few pages from now, I remember chapter 23 in Tanya, I think he says that somewhere. Yeah, a few pages from here. But the Tanya is really where you really see it play itself out, because there he explains it in detail. But the Rebbe Rashab is going to essentially develop it and elaborate on it in a even more expanded way. So before we continue inside, since I gave again another so-called overview, but a little more specific to what we're learning now, anybody wants to ask anything, please feel free to do so.
I wanted to point out something you said earlier about that Hashem has a power of speech to create, but we don't have a power of speech to create. But Hasidus, that we're created Tzelem Elokim, and even if we say pass the salt, we create a movement from the salt, or if we say I love you, we create a feeling, but it doesn't touch your etzem. And I think maybe we could see from the parallel that just because I said pass the salt, or just because I said I love it, doesn't change who I am by essence. And maybe that's how we could see Hashem. Just because he said create the world, create heaven and earth, it doesn't touch his etzem.
I think we all can understand that when you say pass the salt, it's not exactly like creating salt.
No, it's not creating salt, but you're creating a
it's not,
movement.
that's not called creation. Creation means yesh ma'ayin, something that completely, so just let's make that clear. So we don't create with our words. We can affect things and we can affect people and you can hurt people or help people with speech. So I just want to make that very clear. As far as, that the whole point is that we're given the mashal of Dibur in order for us to be able to look at our own speech and see what we can compare. If you look in Tanya, he makes the comparisons of where we compare and where it's different. And one of them is that we don't create. Another one is that he says there our Dibur travels outside of us because we don't encompass all of existence. When I speak to you, I'm not you, and my words are carrying outside. Where Hashem, even when he speaks, which is like to another, there is no real other because everything is encompassed in his reality, except that Tzimtzum doesn't allow us to see that. That's going to be relevant a little later when we learn. So bottom line is, Dibur is used in order to help us understand the idea, but at the same time, we have to always qualify. With every example, there are things that it helps us understand the way God, but then you come to understand that in certain aspects, it's not exactly the same. That's also part of the understanding. So all the examples that we're given, that Torah, Dibra Torah B'Lashon B'nei Adam, when Torah says God has eyes or ears, or God hears or sees and so on. So on one hand, there's something in common, but there's the other hand, it's God and us are not the same. So this is always a two-step process, a two-pronged process of first seeing what's common and then seeing what's not. Essentially, it's what we learned earlier about Mamala Kalalman and Sevav Kalalman. Mamala Kalalman is the divine energy as it relates to us. So then, but then you come to realize, as much as God relates to us, there's what God is beyond us. So it's always a two-step process that first you relate to it, then you realize, one second, there's certain things that distinguish and separate us. And then you come to understand that better, and then you continue that process. It's really an endless process because God is always ultimately going to be beyond us. But that very beyond, he wants us to have access to. So that's part of this whole interface we're talking about. So the actual letters, the shame, is actually part of that interface that gives us something of God, so to speak. But then we come to realize it's only a reflection. It's not Atzmus itself. But we'll learn this more as we go along. Are there any other questions? Anybody else? Okay. So now he continues and says like this. So we're on the line that begins the Erev Shem, Dover Echad. And as I explained on Friday in the last class, how you reconcile that with what we learned earlier, that Erev and Shem are two levels. He does say that earlier, because he's talking here in general terms, especially in the early stage. Then when you break it down, you can start saying that Shem may reflect this level, like he said earlier about Shem. But I also explained that even where he says they're different, it could be that Ur is exactly like Shem in the Etzem, because Ur is not yet Ur, it's not yet Gili. It's only the concept of Gili. Like Shem is the concept of Gili here, even though it hasn't yet manifested in a revealed state. So let's continue learning now. Vihine. On that line, Vihine, page 1417, around 2/3 down the page. And the pages can be found if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com. Now, when we talk about Asius that we've been discussing with Shem, letters, there are a number of types of letters. Not all letters are the same. Kumoi, Asius adibur, like letters of speech. Hen Asius b'bchinas mitzias. Those are letters that have substance because they have to be, they're heard, they're spoken, articulated, and pronounced. So they have substance. Shehein murgoshim el azulas, that are felt and sensed by the other. That's what letters are. V'chol gili el azulas were the Asius adibur. And indeed, all gili, all revelations to another is through letters of speech. Now, of course, obviously, you can also touch another person by hugging them. That's not what he's saying. But the gili, if you want to express yourself, the only way to express to another is through speaking to them, communicating to them. So that's Eish Sadibur. Now, he's saying now in the parentheses there's a level that's even more tangible and more substance and more concrete than Eishis Hadibur. And what's that? Ulamata mehem, meaning lower than the level of speech as far as tangibility goes, as far as substance goes. Hein Eishis Hamaisa are letters of action. What does he mean by that? He means the written word. Vagili elazula say the Eishis Seksav. So Eishis Hamaisa is now the letters are coming down in writing, and you're revealing to another through writing to them. Now, why is this lower? So he says, because hubchinas tzimtzum v'helam yeser. This is more diminished and more concealed. So let me explain what he means about it. As much as it says there's an expression, liba lepuma legalia, which means the heart of a person you can't really reveal through your mouth, through words. That's why there often we say, I don't have the right words to express my love, my gratitude, my thanks. It's not just a manner of speech. It means that certain things, the words simply are containers that can't always contain the full intensity. Doesn't mean words can't express a lot of emotion and a lot of depth. But I remember in volume 1, there was a whole section where we spoke about the limitations of dibur. So what does that mean? Why? Because the fact is, the deeper something is within you, the harder it is to express itself. I've spoken about this many times. When it comes to talking about superficial things like the weather or sports or something like that, you can talk and talk. When it comes to talking about more intimate things, deeper things in your heart and soul, you don't find as many words. Not because you're hiding anything, because words are ultimately limited containers. In writing, it's even more a step away from that. That's why words of thought are closer to the original. Words of speech are one step away from that. And words of written word is even more, furthermore. Now, this does not mean that speaking and writing cannot bring out a new depth. And we see that's why it's so hard to deliver an idea in speech, and especially in writing, because you have to understand it better. But we're talking about the actual expression of it, the expression as it travels through the containers of the letters of speech, the idea gets more diminished. And through writing, even more so. That's what he's saying. As it says elsewhere, Be'inyan hanesira. The sira is the separation when Adam and Eve, who were created like an androgynous being, male and female, God created them, and then he split them. So nesira is called that split. So there's Kabbalah and Chassidus talk about this. So he says elsewhere, when it talks about the nesira, he talks about the split. He talks the split between dibur and then maisa. Rakshalamato. Okay. So we have here now, there's still a parenthesis, we have here Eishis HaDibur, and even more tangible, Eishis HaKsav, where there's even a more bigger tzimtzum and helam. Now he's going to qualify. The difference between, again, human speech and divine speech. Rakshalamata ba'adam, the qualification is like this. But below, by a human being, Eishis HaKsav and Eishis Gashmi Mamish. Letters of written letters are physical letters. You're actually writing A, B, C, or Aleph, Beis, Gimel on a piece of paper. But Lamaila, in other words, in Ruchnis, the way when Hashem used words and letters, Hu inyan b'dvar Hashem shemayim nasu, there where it says b'dvar Hashem, where the word of God, the heavens were created, or heaven was created, the b'chinas hamalchus, b'chinas dibur alien, k'shemekabel miyisod levad, had a b'chinas asiyah. I'll explain in a moment. So what is in Ruchni is the difference between Eishis HaDibur and Eishis HaMaisa. When God spoke, the speaking created existence. It doesn't say he wrote anything down. Even though the Torah is a written Torah, but it says Vayomer Elikim Yehi Oyer. It doesn't say Vayas Oyer. It says Vayomer. So his Dibur, so the Gemara says that Dibur Shal Kodesh Baruch Hu Choshev Maisa. The word of God is considered like action because God's word creates. Our word doesn't create. We can create through Maisa, we can actually go build something. It's also not yesh ma'ayin, but at least you're building something because you're going ahead and building it. By God, His word itself creates. Yet, there's still, just like by us, there's machshava, dibur, maisa. What's the difference between dibur and maisa by Hashem? So in the language of Kabbalah, and I'll explain it, I'll pick this in a moment, Malchus is ultimately, like he says here, is the dibur ha'elyon. Malchus is dibur. Like we say in Tikkun Ezer, Pasach Elyo, dibur, Malchus peh. Malchus is dibur. Because Malchus is carrying the 9 faculties, or the 9 divine attributes from Chachma all the way to Yesod. It's like the king, Malchus, that now the king, Dvar Hashem, Dvar Melech Shalten, the king rules with his speech by giving orders. So Malchus carries that energy and creates Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, creation. So Malchus is Dibur. The question is, Dibur is informed by what? Like I said before, speech, just letters are empty containers. What are they carrying? They carry, in this case, divine energy. They carry what Hashem's Chabad, Chagas, Nihi wants to express. So there's 2 levels of how that is. Dibur can be a channel that's carrying all the spheres, and then it's called Dibur. It's a Dibur that's carrying all the depth, if you wish. A teacher is giving all his depth through his speech. When I say all, obviously it's with some symptom, like I described, that has to be limited, because it's coming through speech, but it's carrying a lot more. Or, like he says, when Malchus is only receiving from Yesod, not from the higher spheres, only from Yesod Malchus. So the Yesod, before Yesod there's Hoyd, and there's Netzach, and then there's Teferes, Gevurah, Chesed, Das, Bina, Chachma. If Malchus is only receiving from Yesod, how is a B'chinas Asiyah? So basically it's like a diminished type of speech. So in other words, there's 2 levels in Malchus in the Dibur. That's the difference between Dibur Elyon and Maisa Elyon. By us, Dibur and Maisa, like he said, actual physical, when you speak, even though it has a physical sound, but it's not physical letters. When you write, it's physical letters. Lamaila, the difference between Dibur and Maisa is where the Malchus is receiving from all the spheres. So basically the flow is coming through Dibur. It's like, or the teacher is, let's say, or the king is just saying 1 word or 2 words. He's not giving you anything really more. So it's really like almost like giving order. I'm asking you to do this without any explanation. That would be Dibur is carrying also an order. It's Dibur, but it's basically Dibur as Lamaila, that would be called Maisa. The Maisa Shebe Dibur, if you wish. Doesn't use those words here, but that's the idea. Whereas by us, Maisa and Dibur are 2 different levels. One is a spoken word, one is the written word. Lamaila, it's the difference between whether Malchus is carrying more of the Dibur is carrying more of the higher spheres, or it's only carrying Yesod, basically only the actionable order. Shem says, this is what I want. And that would be considered like Maisa. So when it comes to Basar Mamoris, Nivra Elam, you could say it's actually the Maisa of Dibur. Because there, you don't have anything more except God saying, I want to have light. But I don't want to say that in a definitive way, because it doesn't say it here, and I would have to look it up to see if that's the case. But basically, he is saying the difference between Maisa and Dibur Lamaila is different than it is by us with this contrast that I just described. That's what he added here. Which also explains why it's a parenthesis, because it's not really the focus of what the Rebbe Rashab wants to discuss. Because at the end of the day, the Bar Hashem Shamayim Nasu, the words of God, heaven was created. So in the days, God's Dibur is considered like Maisa. But to give it a little more clarity and thoroughness, the Rebbe Rashab qualifies in the parentheses the distinction. Okay, but what's higher than Eisis HaDibur? We spoke now what's lower than Eisis Maisa, the written word. What's higher? So he says, Ulamayla Mazeh, higher than Dibur is another form of letters, and that says Eisis HaMachshava, letters of thought. So now we see already that in letters themselves, there's a whole gradation, there's a bunch of levels. Now let me just say a few things about letters of thought before we read inside. Most of us, I remember when I first learned that there's Eisis HaMachshava, I remember I asked our Mashpia, who was teaching us, the Mimer, that we were learning, I said, where are there letters in thought? We don't think with letters. Yes, if I have to prepare a speech, or I want to prepare exactly what I'm going to say, I may say in my mind, the words that I'm going to say later through my mouth. You know, we say words in our thoughts, even without expressing them. But that's when you're thinking specifically how you're going to articulate something. You know, how you're going to phrase it. What exact words are you going to use? But then there's thought, you're just thinking an idea. So I remember he answered, and it was something I always remember. And then, of course, I understood it better when I started learning more Chassidus. That it's just that the Isis, we also think with letters. It's just the letters are far more subtle. So they're not tangible. So you don't realize you're thinking with letters. But every idea has to have parameters. And what are those parameters? Letters. Again, so it's not letters that, like I'm articulating right now, letters that you can hear exactly a pronunciation of a letter. So just like Maisa, when you write letters, they're far more tangible than the spoken letters. So thought compared to speech is similar. An example would be, you put an object, you throw it in the water. The object is there, but the water is so overpowering that the object seems to have disappeared. So the letters in Machshava are far more overshadowed by the intensity of the energy of the idea. So if letters are like Kalim, and the idea is like Oir, in Machshava, the Oir is much more powerful than the Keli. That's why you don't feel it. In Dibur, the Oir becomes more diminished, and the Keli becomes more prominent. That's why you hear the letters. And in Maisa, the Oir becomes even more diminished, and the Keli become even more tangible and concrete. And that's why letters of speech of written letter is so much more defined. So that's what he's going to address now. Isis HaMachshava.
But this is not in the nefesh. This is only a levush for the nefesh. The goof should know what the nefesh thinks. That is Isis HaMachshava.
Well, the difference being is that the nefesh is keiches hanefesh. Well, is keiches hanefesh the nefesh? I mean, if you're going to go there, the nefesh is the nefesh. The nefesh has faculties like chokhmah bina das. Machshava is the active process of conscious thinking. Chokhmah bina das is the very faculties. So even when you're asleep, you have chokhmah bina das.
But that's okay. Only when it's mislabish beguf, right? The nefesh itself,
not necessarily. A neshama l'mayla doesn't think, doesn't.
I don't know. I don't know if it's called thinking.
It's not necessarily dafka when it's mislabish beguf. It's what you'd say the levushim versus the keiches, which is not really the issue. I'll just say something since you're familiar with it. Levushim are the expressions. They're like garments. They don't have any substance, but without them, there's no expression. In other words, you could have the 10 faculties. Chabad is your pure power of seichel, but it doesn't mean you're consciously thinking right now. Machshava is the process of thinking. But I don't want to confuse matters. It's not really so relevant to our discussion here. Okay. Ulamayla mizeh, esis hamachshava. Higher than esis hadibur are letters of thought. Shein dakim veruchnim, shein nirgoshim el azulas. They're subtle and ethereal, and they're not felt by another. When speaking, it's very clear the other person hears your words, but they can't read your thoughts, and they don't hear your thoughts. Rak murgoshin la'atzmei. They're only sensed by you yourself, by the person himself. You know what you're thinking. The gile helam ha'atzmi legabe atzmi hu the ishis hamachshava. I know helam ha'atzmi is going to throw everyone here. I'll explain what that means here. The gile helam ha'atzmi, that which is fundamentally concealed within you, legabe atzmi hu the ishis hamachshava. Okay, so what does he mean here by the word helam ha'atzmi? It seems like it's coming from nowhere. I'm not talking about atzmus here. He's giving an example of machshava. So why would he use the word helam ha'atzmi? So I'm almost sure I discussed it the first time we learned it. Is he hinting to the nimshal, how it is lamayla by Hashem and helam ha'atzmi? Or does he mean here more just the term that there are things that are fundamentally concealed within your heart and soul that you don't express to others, but when you want yourself to express it to yourself, it's through the asis of machshava. But then why does he call it Helam Ha'atzmi? Helam Ha'atzmi means fundamentally concealed, that's never revealed, even to yourself. So that's what leads me to say that he's probably not talking about Helam Ha'atzmi that he spoke about earlier, because there, even God himself is not aware. When I say not aware, it doesn't mean he's not aware. It doesn't need to be aware. It's just a state of being, Helam Ha'atzmi. Doesn't need any revelation. But on the other hand, maybe he's hinting to the fact that even the Helam Ha'atzmi from Elokus, ultimately through shame, Esis Hashem, that itself also begins to be expressed to himself. I can't say definitively. I lean toward the former rather than the latter, but I just wanted to explain, since he's using that word, and we have used Helam Ha'atzmi throughout here in Ayin Beis, it's hard for me to imagine Rebbe Rashab, is he referring to that Helam Ha'atzmi? So initially I would say not, but maybe he's hinting to it. So I don't want to say anything definitive. Just learning it, it can be a little confusing. I'm just articulating my own thinking on it without coming to any formal conclusion. So for all practical purposes, I would say, getting back to the context here, what he's saying is like this, that there is a state within every nefesh that is concealed, even from yourself. Dibur for sure doesn't reveal that. So even when you speak, you're not revealing your deepest Helam. Machshava does have that element because it's not nirgish to another. Another person cannot hear your thoughts. They don't know your thoughts. But you yourself can, when you consciously thinking, you're saying, what am I feeling right now? My deeper feeling. And your conscious thought is concentrating on it. And sometimes we ourselves are in doubt. Like, what do I really feel? Like many times you have a question and you start thinking about it and saying, so what do I do in this situation? So what's your thought doing? Your thought is processing only for yourself that which is going on in the Helam Ha'atzmi in your nefesh, and you yourself are not clear what to do. I'm just giving an example. It could be other examples as well. But bottom line is, that's what machshava does. It's a gili of a Helam within you, but it's only to you. Just reading it again. Shein mergoshna lazos like mergoshna atzme. The gili Helam atzme legaba atzme the esis hamachshava. So esis hamachshava, because he's trying to say here, it's not just that thought you haven't yet revealed to someone else. In other words, you could think about it and only you know what you're thinking. Then you decide you want to share that. He's going further. There are things that you're not going to share because it's only to yourself. That's what it sounds like he wants to say. I'm not sure why the Rebbe Rashab is deliberately going here. Why does he have to add this line? I suspect that we'll find out shortly. Once he starts developing, we'll probably see that this line is important in understanding the development of the idea. But I'm just telling you what I see right now. So that's what he's saying. Again, that the higher than dibur is machshava, which is more subtle, more sublime, more ethereal. They're not felt azulas, only to themselves. And he explains what that means. Because the gili of Helam Ha'atzmi, legaba atzmei, when you're revealing the Helam Ha'atzmi, even if the Helam Ha'atzmi is beyond revelation, but when whatever part of it you want to reveal to yourself, that's through letters of thought, not through letters of speech. Because letters of speech are to another, not to yourself. Like, for example, when a person understands something on their own, you're learning something, you're not communicating to anyone else, you're learning and understanding it yourself. Who are you? The esis hamachshava. So when you're learning it, your mind is becoming activated, and this are the letters of thought that are consciously understanding that which you're learning, or that which you're, whatever it is that you're comprehending. So from this line, it's pretty clear that a Helam Ha'atzmi, he means that it was first initially concealed, but esis hamachshava are like tools and instruments that reveal that to yourself at least. That's what he says so far. So that's now esis hadibur. In the parentheses, he covered esis hamaisa, written letter, and now he's gone higher to esis hamachshava. So we have several levels of letters. Let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything.
My question is, and I know you haven't said he's talking about Helamatzmi above. I get that, and there's some remez. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I heard what you said, but just talking about the concept of something that's fundamentally concealed, how can it be revealed? If it's fundamentally concealed, how can it be revealed?
So that's why I said, that's why I lean toward that he's not talking about a fundamentally concealed level. He's talking Helamatzmi means that it's initially concealed, and it's not necessarily means that it's fundamentally concealed. That's one way.
And also,
in other words, it's more of a manner of speech rather than the Helamatzmi we learned about earlier. One second. That's one answer I gave. The second, that maybe he's referring to that whatever God wants to ultimately, let's say he wants to reveal something from Helamatzmi, so how will it be revealed is through letters of thought. And maybe he means that. I'm not sure. And as I said, that second explanation I just gave, I would wait to see how this develops to see if that has any accurate. Because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, the Helam Ha'atzmi is ultimately also not the ultimate. By God, Helam and Gili are one. So what do you mean fundamentally concealed means it doesn't need to be revealed. It's fundamentally beyond revelation and beyond concealment altogether. So in a way, it could be that La'asid Lavi, when we will experience it all, maybe the Helam Ha'atzmi will be experienced in some way of Gili. I don't know. It could be that's what, but it's hard for me to imagine that that's what he's hinting to in one half a line here, where he's talking about the human being. That's why I'm being careful whether he's even referring to that. But it could be that he is, and it could be that later something will emerge that will see that he wanted to say. I'm being full transparency, just giving you everything I understand here. But I'm also saying I'm not sure how this is going to ultimately develop.
Thank you.
Yeah, it would be very nice if he just said the Gili Helam, the Gaba Atzme Idea. Why he says Hatzmi? That's the thing that I'm not sure. I'm not even, however you explain it, I'm not sure why is the Rebbe Rashab even bring it here. What's he trying to? By throwing that in here, it just like it throws you and you start thinking. So 1 second, what are we talking about here? That suddenly the Helam Atzmi in the deepest level Machshava reveals. I mean, you could argue that Machshava, as deep as Machshava is, and deeper than Dibur, does it really reveal that? Are we even aware of our deepest, innermost levels of Etzem HaNefesh? So that's why anyway, I think I said enough.
Maybe he's paralleling us to Hashem, like that we have the Helam Ha'atzmi inside of each of us.
Maybe not. I'm not sure. Anyway, any other questions?
I don't know if this is a good time, but I had a question about Yesod and all the spheres coming.
So let's save that for later. Yeah. Let's save that for later. You mean Yesod, what we learned in the parentheses? Yesod and Malchus?
Yeah, that's like the difference between Yesod coming just from Yesod or from, I thought that always it came through Yesod.
Or it's only Yesod. The Maisa is only Yesod. Of course it comes through Yesod. The question is whether there are more levels coming through or only Yesod.
But Yesod carries within it all the levels. Isn't that the...
No, sometimes it doesn't always. It's sometimes, I just gave an example. You just give an order to someone. It doesn't have Chachma Bina Das in it, even though it may be concealed. It's only Yesod is flowing. It's a common thing that a sphere that you can get like just the outer dimension. That's it. Yesod to Malchus without all the background behind it.
Before you mentioned the ACS and Sira, what is this adding to Havana?
He didn't say ACS, he said Be'inyan HaNesira. He's just telling us where it's discussed elsewhere. He didn't in the Maimer, was a Maimorim that talk about Nesira, talk about this concept of Machshava Dibur. That's all he's saying. So I would suggest, if you really want to know, I would go look in the Marmakamis in the indexes on the Maimorim on the Sida where it's discussed. Okay. Continuing on, right? However, now he's qualifying. Even this Esis HaMachshava that we just spoke about, the letters of thought, Zeu b'chitzenius ha'seichel, sheba b'levushei ha'sogeh. When we say that when a person wants to understand seichel on their own through the letters of thought, this is in the outer dimension of intelligence that come in the garments of comprehension, of asog. Aval pnimius haseichel, but the inner dimension of intelligence, shelamayla melavush hasog, that are beyond the garments of comprehension, v'chein, and the same, that's in general, the pnimius haseichel. In other words, there's levels of seichel that are not containable even by the letters of thought. That's what he's getting to now. So we see, we say to you, all the depth of your mind, are you aware of it all? So of course the answer is no. As much as thought you give, as much as you learn, as much as you understand, as much as you know, it's still a certain measure. There are definitely more levels in seichel that are beyond, that have not yet, your machshava has not yet accessed. Now that could be simply because you haven't worked hard enough, or it could be fundamentally the seichel is like a wellspring of so many ideas, and machshava is just the ones that you consciously have channeled into your being. It's just like someone will say, have you shared with everyone everything you know? The answer is no. There's no person that shared everything they know. It's impossible, frankly. Because whatever you know, there's always more. You could say, I shared a lot. I shared some of it. So the same thing, machshava is a channel that channels ideas into your conscious thought. But pnimius haseichel is higher than levush hasog. Then he goes furthermore. And so too, b'chol seichel, in every intelligent idea, when he delves deeper into the inner and the depth of the idea, so now, in other words, it's not just understanding it on the outer level, pnimius. Sham eina esis negoshim gam la'atzmei. Now, the letters of thought that before you sensed it, because you sense those letters because you're dealing with something on a more external level. But pnimius haseichel, and when you go deeper into something, then even to yourself you don't sense the letters of thought.
Is he talking about the subconscious here?
Not necessarily. We'll see. Let's see how it goes. Like we see.
That's not even machshava.
He didn't say that. Why don't we just finish the idea and we'll see what he's going to say? He didn't say that. He says, "Ein esis negoshim." The letters are not felt even to himself. Let's see where he's going. Let's see. Like we see in actuality. What do we see? When a person is exerting their mind. In any profound idea, they're really completely immersed and consumed with a deep concentration. That you don't at all feel any letters. No, it's only the only thing that you're sensing is the idea itself. So my understanding of this is no, not subconscious at all. He's talking about basically different levels. Like I mentioned before, that when you're ready to, sometimes you want to say something to someone, but you want to formulate the words in your own mind. So there, everybody, there's your margish letters. You actually can say to yourself, you're speaking, and I'm not saying even articulating speaking to yourself in the privacy of your own privacy, but just in your mind, you're saying the words. I'm going to say, thank you. So in your mind, you can sense the words, the letters, thank you. That everyone understands. Then there's more, a chesenius haseichel is when you think of an idea, but you think of it in structural form. So there too, even though you may not literally be articulating in your thought letters, but you can have parameters. Like, I often will prepare, and before I speak, I'll sometimes think through my mind, what am I going to be saying? So I may not think in actual letters, but I will think in structure and say, okay, paragraph 1, I'm going to start with this. Then I'm going to move into here. So there, you are sensing letters, but not necessarily as precise as when you say to yourself, I'm going to say thank you, or I'm going to say welcome. So there, But once you start getting more concentrated into the pneumius of the idea, or in general a deeper concept, the depth of the idea, we'll call it the oir of the idea, becomes so powerful that you don't sense at all letters. All you sense is an idea. Later, you can say, okay, now I'm going to take that idea and I'm going to break it down into a structure and ultimately into letters. So what he's talking about here is similar. Let me finish, please. What he's talking here is similar to what I often describe. It's just an example, but I'm describing that when you're reading a book, you're reading a sefer, a book, so you see letters, and you study the letters and you try to understand them. But there comes a point when you're reading on your own, and you get so absorbed in what you're reading, you don't even see letters anymore. Obviously, you're seeing letters because you wouldn't be able to read if you didn't see them. But you're so absorbed by you could say even mesmerized by the story. You don't even realize you're turning pages. You don't realize that you're going from paragraph to paragraph. You could always stop yourself and say, hey, I'm reading a book, and you can stop. But when you're in that moment, you literally can be crying, laughing, sweating. The story takes over. So what happened to the letters? They didn't disappear. It's just that you're not experiencing them. Because right now, you're completely absorbed by the oir. I'm using the language of Chassidus, the energy of the idea, as opposed to structure. Then, very often, I've done this many times, then I want to really understand, really great authors. You want to learn how can they write so well that you don't even realize that you write the words and you're just experiencing an experience as if you were there. I remember when I read, it's maybe not appropriate to bring here with Ayin Beis, but I remember when I read the first time The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And I was so taken by the way he wrote, I went back and said, let me now dissect the letters and the words he used to get me to that place. It's like a song. You're hearing a song. So initially you hear the phrases, the words, or the no words, or the sections. Then the song takes you to another, transports you to another time and place. You don't even realize you're listening to a song. You're just completely completely been transported. Then you go back and say, oh wow, this is a song. There's musical notes. You can replicate it if you know how to play music. You could dissect it, break it down. The point that he's saying here is that when he wants to really come down to ultimately in the Ma'arich Be'echad, that when you move from first the letters, Yehi Oyer, that God created Oyer, and then from the letters you move to the energy within the letters, there comes a point where the letters become like superfluous, or you don't even notice them. They become something that completely dissolves in the presence of the Oyer. And that's real Hisbonenus that leads a person first from structure to beyond structure. That's where he's really going with all of this. So he's coming to teach us how you move from, first you begin with letters, obviously, but then you come to the experience that transcends the letters. We'll see how he develops this, but this is what he's saying here. Okay, I'm going to stop here. So any questions?
So you explained that this is still machshava. It's pnimius inyan, but still machshava.
And machshava, where you're not margish the letters of machshava. Yeah.
Right.
Going back to just since there's if no one else has any other questions.
One second. I will just say that this is going to go a few pages, so we're far from finished. It's not like this is over with. I think it's going to get clear once he starts explaining the nimshal. This is still technically a moshel, how it is by us machshava and by us dibur machshava. But I think he's going to get back to. So we'll see how this all manifests. But I will say that you have to keep in mind. This goes back to something I point out always. The Chassidus takes us on a journey into places that are beyond the tangible. But we're tangible people. Everything is tangible. That's a big part of why it's so difficult to absorb and not process. We process because we're processing on our terms. which makes sense. That's, of course, what you want to do. You want to be able to have a handle on it. But the real goal is ultimately to lose yourself in the experience. But you have to do that in stages. Obviously, you can't just get absorbed in the highest levels of Oyer and lose all your Kalim and your Oisius. That's why it's in stages. But ultimately, you have to realize that is the goal. The goal is to take us to a place that's beyond our I'll say, sensory and tangible experiences, where you become part of something greater than you've ever been, or greater than you've ever been aware of. That's really, so keep in mind, the more you're ready to surrender to that, the more you'll experience this. But it is stages. You can't jump, because not everybody, you can't just jump from step one all the way to the top. But this is the gradual process. And you'll see soon how ha-mayrich be'echad, the mayrich, that's why it's mayrich.
That's the avoido, real avoido of the
Exactly. You can't. Why don't we start? Why even tzaddikim? Why don't we start with Shemoneh Esrei every day? It doesn't work that way. You start with Moedani, Birchas HaShachar, Psukah D'Zimra, Birchas Krishma, Shema, Hagdama, then finally Shemoneh Esrei. So it's exactly the story. It's a process of growth, and the process that as we slowly grow, what happens is the Oisius of yesterday become the stepping stones to the next step, but then you get more into the Oyer. But there's always going to be some form of, because we want an interface here that's complete. I just wanted to add that point to understand the context there. Go ahead. You were going to ask something?
Yeah, I mean, it's a digression. It's almost something that should go off the recording. But anyways, we're there. So Eli Shava was talking about, we can use words to create, so to speak, kiviyachol. And you're like, wait a second. It's not so simple because we're not God. But just along that tangent, it says like you shouldn't. One of the reasons you shouldn't say lashon hara is because you give energy to that. Let's say you're calling attention to some defect or some imperfection of a person, some mistake they made or whatever, and the Indian is like or something's. Whatever, something negative.
Well, you could destroy a person's life by bad mouthing them and their reputation. We understand
that goes without saying. But there's a notion that by calling something out, you're giving energy to it. That's the part of the question I want to focus on. And it seems like we do have some ability, some power, because because of our neshamas are part of God. It seems that we can add we can give energy to something by speaking it out. No.
And then if someone asks you, so therefore, are we like God and we can create a world like this? What would you say?
I'm just asking about the Ayin. What's going on there? Just in that one little mashal, what's going on there in a Hasidic perspective?
That we have power and we can change things and we can destroy, or we can, thank God, build. We can build a dir b'tachtenim for God himself. That's...
There are stories about the Magid, big tzaddik.
But I don't see why we have to.
And we could create yesh miyesh.
There's a Maimer Chazal that says about Yaakov, just K'moshe Chodesh Baruch Hu bara Eilamis Kach Yaakov bara Eilamis. You're going to find Maimer Chazal that say that we have the power to create. It says Gedela Ma'aser Tzadikim and Ma'aser Shemayim va'aretz. That the work of tzaddikim is even greater than the work of creation. Chassidus explains, because God creates yesh ma'ayin, and we take yesh and turn it back to ayin. So if you're talking figuratively or conceptually, of course we have the power to do that. But I think we all understand Bereshis bara l'kimis hashemayim v'sa'aretz, that only God has the power to create a yesh ma'ayin ve'efes hamuchlat, to the point of what existence is. I don't see this as all equatable in any way. If you want to use the word that we have the power to achieve things, to build things, and even sometimes using the power to, but it's not creation of existence. No person has ever created anything. And it's actually hepecha kol amuna to say that anything but God creates. The Rebbe once wrote, I remember, in a note to me, on Mishpatim Toshim Emdali, he was talking about technology actually. He says, Chaz v'sholem v'rachman etzlan, to say that anyone can create except God. So I don't think it's a contradiction at all. I think you just have to Just use a little discretion and subtlety to understand. So use the word, just the word bara. Yeah, you'll find maybe that term used, but everyone understands the immediate qualification that it's not the Bereshis bara yesh ma'ayin of creation. That's
No, I wasn't trying to.
One second. So though this question is fair, it's completely not relevant to our conversation.
Off the recording. I said off the recording. I knew it was.
Yeah. No, I'm fine. Yeah.
Oh, is Trach with the Sein good? Is that just creating a different perception, or does it create a somewhat of a reality for us?
Trach good with Sein good did not create heaven and earth, and did not create light, and the firmament and the human being and everything in existence. As much as the effect that it has, but it's really, I do want to, if that's what we want to discuss, and I don't really have so much time today, but I think it should be a completely different discussion. It has nothing to do with Ayin Beis here, which, as I said, I would point that out. So is it a legitimate conversation? Absolutely. Fair. But let me ask you something. And here's I am so right now consumed and absorbed with Ayin Beis, so I'm happy to change channels if you want me to. But you have to understand, it has nothing to do with Ayin Beis here. Does everyone understand that? I want to make that very clear. We're not talking about anything that we're learning here. It's something that is intriguing and clearly has triggered in a few of you these ideas. But this is a typical example of complete processing and of nothing to do with what we're learning in Ayin Beis. It's not a critique. I just want to make it, for the record, clear. That's all.
But he's saying that letters create, that the creation coming from letters. We're talking about oisios.
I understand. I stand by what I said. It has nothing to do with Ayin Beis. It's to do with what's on your mind that was triggered by something we read in Ayin Beis. That's all I'm saying. And it's fine. That happens all the time. That's how people process. As a chayzer, I could never afford to do that. If that, I wouldn't have been able to write any of the Rebbe's Farbrengens if I did that. But again, this is not a critique. I understand this is the natural tendency. That's why not everybody can be a chayzer. And I want you to understand, this is not critique. It's an observation that I think for the record is important to state. And that's all I'm saying, It's perfectly fine. You know how many pages of Chassidus there are? Tens of thousands of pages. Not everything is connected to everything. So it's perfectly fine. You can discuss, it mentions Mamala Kalam in here. I could show you my more hundreds of pages that talk about Mamala Kalam and that we could definitely go there. It's just that nobody seemed to be triggered there. Here you are, which is fine. I just want to make that qualification. Yitzchak said it right. It's a fine discussion, but it's nothing to do. It's like if we mentioned Hey Gvuras, and someone would say, 1 second, talking about Hey Gvuras, why did God allow the Holocaust? Of course it's connected to Gvuras, but it's not connected to Ayin Beis. That's all I'm pointing out. So you know what? Since we're already there, let me stop here. We're at the bottom of page, literally the last line of page 1417. Let me stop the recording.